Hello ladies and gentlemen, once again this is Jeremy Smith. Not long ago we took a look at the Canon Rebel T7i, and it seems like a lot of folks have questions because you guys kept asking me about the T7i versus the 77D, and I kind of glossed over the 77D before, but now I want to go ahead and make a video to kind of describe the differences. Now, before I jump into this video, I will go ahead and thank Bedford Cam and Video for allowing me to borrow both these cameras. If you guys would like to purchase either of these cameras or anything else, check out the link in the description below. That helps support this channel and helps me get my hands on more exciting cameras to bring you videos about. Looking at the T7i and the 77D though, they're both extremely similar. A lot of folks had a lot of things to say about how the camera was named. People said, well, where did they get 77D from? So to clear that up, first of all, the 77D is the successor to the T6s. And really, T6s is not a name that makes a lot of sense. S in a Canon model number typically means that the camera is higher resolution. So think 1DS or 5DS. Both those cameras were higher resolution variants of another model. The T6s though was not higher resolution. So whenever Canon decided to come out with a sort of camera in this generation, they called it the 77D, and I think that name, although a little confusing, makes more sense than adding an S. Now, both these cameras are exactly identical in terms of their picture quality. They both have the same 24 megapixel sensor, they both use the same Digic 7 processor, they both can do up to 6 frames a second in a burst, they both have the same 45-point autofocus system. So what on earth is the difference between these two cameras if the quality is and the speed is the same? Well, stick around and we'll take a closer look. Taking a closer look at the Canon Rebel T7i and 77D, the first thing that I noticed about these cameras, whenever I first picked them up and turned them on, was the difference in menu systems. Now, if you guys have watched my Rebel T7i video, I talk about this at length, but basically, I'll kind of give you a little bit of a recap. On the T7i, it takes a sort of guided approach to its menu system. So whenever you go in and start looking at things like your scene modes and different manual modes and so on, it gives you this guided interface, which I find to be very useful. Whenever you go in, even if you go all the way to the point of starting to use the manual settings and everything, you go in here and you kind of get a nice little description about what things are doing. So as you change things like shutter speed and aperture and ISO, you kind of get a little bit of a graphical representation of what these things do. There's a little bit of a sort of position there on the dial that kind of warns you that if you go below that 60th of a second mark, you kind of start to get into potential for blurry images. So you have all these little helpful hints. If you go over to something like one of your scene modes, on most cameras you actually can't really do anything to control the look of your image in these modes, but I applaud Canon for this because they give you a little description here. But whenever you go into the actual scene mode, you can control things like the use of your flash. So you can go in here and have it on automatic, or you can turn it off. You can force it to be on. You can even go in here and adjust your exposure compensation, but since a photographer may be just starting out and they may not know what exposure compensation is yet, it gives you things in very simple terms. So it just says brightness. So you can go in there and you're changing exposure compensation, but you basically have a nice guided way of changing that without a lot of tech jargon. So I like this interface. Now on the on the 7070 rather, this camera is set up basically like a classic Canon camera. They're basically assuming that you already know how to use the camera. So whenever you turn it on, you'll get your sort of classic Canon interface. It still looks a lot the same as before. You'll notice that they also give you the locking mode dial. Now, I'm not really sure why camera companies do this, but there's this sort of impression that only more advanced users bump their dials and no one else. I think camera companies should stop being chintzy about this and just give us our locking mode dials, for goodness sakes. I think it's silly to make that an upgrade feature. But if we go in here and we start to change our modes a little bit like this, everything looks very similar at first, But once I go into my sort of exposure mode, you'll notice that instead of having the guided interface, it looks exactly like all your other Canon cameras, but we still have the guide out here. Now, it's important to note that on either of these cameras, you can turn these views on or off. So I can go in here to this option in our menu, and you can see I can enable, I can turn off the mode guide, I can turn off the feature guide if I want to, or I could also turn on some of those other guides that are turned on the Rebel T7i, but with this being a more advanced model, they have them off by default. So that's a little bit of a difference. The thing about this camera, though, that sort of appeals to a user that may be getting more advanced as time goes on, is that you have a little bit better controls. Now, guys, if you never get anything through your head on this channel, note that image quality is only one small aspect of what makes one camera better than the other. A lot of times it has to do with usability. So let's say that you've got yourself a shiny new T7i and you're shooting it, and you finally get to the point where you start using the manual settings. You're going to be a little bit more frustrated by this camera as you get more advanced, just because on this particular camera, you basically are limited in your controls. So even if you go in here and you say, okay, I'm going to turn off some of these more advanced, these more sort of amateur displays and controls. Let's say you go in here and you turn off all this sort of thing. So you disable everything there. And now you've got your big boy pants on, or big girl pants on, and you're ready to continue on with things. Now, the thing is, though, if you're in manual mode, you only have one dial. So you start to change all your settings, and you can do so fairly easily. But to change your aperture, you have to press and hold a button here to rotate there. So that's how that changes. And not exactly ideal. And you also have just your rear LCD to see your controls and settings on. On a camera like the 77D, this camera actually gives us two different command dials. So if we are in our manual mode, like this, we now have the ability to change our shutter speed here, but we can change our aperture here. This is basically how it's set up on Canon's higher end cameras. It's very much like the Canon 80D, so that's a little bit of a difference there. The other thing that you guys will notice that is different is that we also have an AF on button. So I'm going to bring a video in the future about this particular feature, but basically this allows a user to have their focus controlled with a separate button as opposed to the half press of the shutter. So there's a whole advantage to that, and we'll talk about that at a later date. But you do have that on this camera as well, and you do not have that on the T7i, as you will notice. The other thing, control-wise, that you see is that we have this nice top LCD. Now, I don't know, this is something that's been a staple on higher-end cameras for quite some time. Sometimes, depending on what position you're shooting in, you may find it helpful to be able to use this. I personally, I don't know, I'm kind of indifferent about them. They're okay. But do note that they're usually associated with higher-end cameras, and it's basically just another place where you can see all of your settings. So that's how that works out. So pretty straightforward. Another thing about this camera is that you also have a sensor on the back of the camera. So a lot of times whenever I was using the Rebel T7i, I'd find myself raising the camera up to my eye, and the display would kind of stay on. And so there is a setting in the menu here. Let me see if I can find it again. I like to do this all on the fly with no cuts. So let's just see. There it is right there. LCD off on button is what it's called. Basically, this just allows you to control when and or if the rear display goes off. By default, whenever you press the shutter button, it turns that off. So that way your face is not accidentally hitting it. But on the 77D, it's a lot more convenient because on this camera, you have this sensor back here. So as soon as you raise the camera to your eye, that sensor shuts off the screen, which I think is a nice feature. It might sound silly, but I do find it useful because sometimes when I'm looking through the camera, I may be adjusting some of my settings and I may not have hit the shutter button yet. And at that time, the display would normally be on, but on this camera, it knows it's up to my face and it automatically turns off. So that's basically how that works out. Everything else though, image quality wise, I have some samples for you guys in the description below. They're actually the same samples that I used whenever I tested the T7i initially, and no, there will be no difference between image quality between both these cameras. They're both going to be outstanding and identical. As I mentioned before, they use the same processor, the same image sensor, and so on. Now, the controls are better on the 77D, but they're still below the Canon 80D, and that's definitely a comparison that we'll be doing in a future video, because the 80D adds not only some better controls, but that's also where we see a change in performance. But no, once again, there's still not going to be an image quality difference even going to that camera. So anyways, but we will discuss the 80D compared to these in another video in the future. In the meantime, write me in the comments below. Let me know what you'd like to see. Let me know if you have questions. And of course, there will be lots of new videos coming as always. Be sure to check me out on social media. I am Photog J the Great. Man, the only shame is I just haven't fully realized my own greatness yet. But I will certainly get to that stage one day. Anyways, guys, until next time, this is Jeremy Smith, signing off.